Australia is currently in the midst of a series of crises. Housing in most urban areas is completely unaffordable. Mortgage holder stress is rising with every single rate rise. The cost of electricity is huge. The water bill is astronomical. Rent is so expensive that people who could once afford to live by themselves are now being forced to live in share houses, shipping containers, or random people's garages. And just when you thought things couldn't get any worse, we're now staring down the barrel of an impending fuel crisis, where unleaded petrol will currently set you back $2.50 per litre, with diesel at over $3 a litre and climbing. That's even if you can get it. What are we doing to fix these problems? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Take the housing crisis, for example. Now, this is something we could solve if we wanted to, but we won't. We're now being distracted by a more current manufactured crisis centered around petrol. It's almost like the government just makes up new crises so that it doesn't have to contend with existing ones. What are they going to do when they run out of crises? Might actually have to start doing their job. But what if manufacturing crises actually is their job? Apologies, I am digressing. Believe it or not, solving the housing situation here in this country is actually pretty straightforward and consists of 4 basic steps. Step 1, temporarily suspend all immigration into the country. For the time being, no offers of permanent residency unless under special circumstances. Step 2, ban all foreign ownership of Australian property. Step 3, build social and affordable housing and offer them exclusively to birth certificate Australians who do not currently own a home and are looking to get into the market. Step 4, tether the costs of the homes to no greater than 4 times the average national yearly income. Done. Fixed. Easy. At this point, however, you might be thinking, what the hell would you know? And if it were that easy, wouldn't the government have done it by now? You might even be thinking, that sounds wonderful, mate, but building houses costs money, lots of money. And where are we going to get it? It doesn't just grow on trees, you know. Well, it turns out that growing it on trees might actually require some effort, something that our public servants are chronically allergic to. So luckily for them, there's a much simpler way for governments to make their money. And it might not be the way most of us might think. However, before we reveal this mysterious system of money creation, let's have a look at some of the more traditional ways that the Australian government builds its bank balance. Yes, that's right, I'm talking about taxation. It is a well-known fact that here in this country, the thought of having to pay our taxes tends to make most of us shudder. It's probably no surprise to learn then that Australians pay some of the highest rates of personal income tax anywhere in the developed world, 4th to be precise, as well as topping the list in just about every other form of taxation metric. Not only do we hate tax, but we also despise anyone who suggests raising them, even if it is for virtuous ends. And in addition to this robust hatred, taxation also happens to be a topic that most of us tend to find incredibly boring. And no wonder, they make it boring and mundane and convoluted and jargonistic so that we don't go looking into it. We stay the hell away from it. What is perfectly clear, however, is that if most of us were to all of a sudden become aware of the cruel and unusual ways in which the Australian government is ripping us off through taxation, we might not find it such a boring subject after all. So, without further ado, let us have a look at how an archaic and parasitic system, initially proposed as a way to raise funds for the First World War, a system that we have never given our consent to participate in, is now being used to extract money from everyday Australians to distribute as wealth amongst the ruling elite. So I guess the first question we have to ask is, where does the Australian government actually get its money? The answer in simple terms, as we touched on earlier, is tax. But the word tax tends to turn a lot of people off. So what you'll hear in its place are terms like excise, levy, tariff, and duty, just to name a few. And whilst these labels might help to sugarcoat the fact that the Australian government has its finger in practically every portion of the economic pie, there is one extremely plump and incredibly juicy piece that it just can't seem to get enough of. I am, of course, talking about personal income tax. According to a recent report from the ATO, the Australian government collected just over $311 billion of personal income tax in the 2023-2024 financial year. A truly stunning accomplishment when you consider that there are only 16 million Aussies in the workforce. The report also indicated that for the very first time in our nation's history, the amount of tax collected by all three levels of government exceeded $1 trillion. So between the Commonwealth, 6 states, 2 territories, and 538 local councils, they managed to amass more than $1 trillion through personal income tax, company tax, and other tax-related streams. When we stop to consider that only $140 billion was raised from company tax streams, this seems like a rather excessive amount for the everyday Australian to have to fork up. The next logical question that follows on from there, I guess, would have to be if personal income tax is $311 billion, company tax is $140 billion, where does the other $549 billion come from? Well, I'm glad you asked. And to give us an idea, let's have a look at some of the various examples of the financial leeching that the Australian government has perfected. First up, we have the Goods and Services Tax, or the GST. GST collects $90.2 billion on average per annum and is assigned to the states for them to do their level best with. Next, we have capital gains tax, which nets approximately $51 billion per annum. We have a nifty little one called fringe benefit tax, which brings in a cool $3.3 billion. Let's not forget petroleum tax at $21.9 billion, which could almost double if fuel costs keep rising. There is the minerals tax, $60 billion, tobacco tax, $7 billion, alcohol tax, $5 billion, gambling tax, $9.4 billion. I haven't even mentioned superannuation, which requires a whole other video on its own. So for the time being, I'm just going to leave that out. But what about the fees? Let's not forget the fees. Yes, licensing fees for the car. That's at least $1.2 billion a year. Passport fees are a little over $1 billion. School fees, these have gone up 40% in the last 2 years. They bring in $1.2 billion every year. And last, but by certainly no means least, the government collected $4.9 billion in university fees, a sum that is in fact greater than the amount collected from the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax, the PRRT, which is a tax on excess profits made by oil and gas companies. As staggering as these numbers appear to be, an even more alarming figure is revealed when we truly consider the amount of tax we have to pay that is not included in our individual income tax. The average yearly income here in this country is $80,000, meaning that roughly 20%, give or take, of your income goes towards the government in the form of personal income tax. Again, this figure will of course vary based on income, but bear with me. If we then take the $500 odd billion that the government collects through its lesser known taxes, like the tax you pay when you're having a beer or renewing your driver's license or sending your kids to school, and then we divide that number by the number of taxpayers, what we'll find is a figure that is really quite shocking. So at this point, you might be thinking, what are you even talking about? Oh, hidden tax. I've gone to work, I've paid my tax, it's done. The government's got their bit, I don't have to go to jail for tax evasion, I can go on living my life. The government doesn't need any more money from me, right? Wrong. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but there is still more tax to pay. Much more tax to pay. If we return to the equation we touched on earlier, that is the amount of tax we have to pay or that the government collects that has not been accounted for by your income or through company tax, specifically the $549 billion that is spilling out of the government's purse, what we'll find is that each and every Aussie, on average, is paying $34,000 of hidden additional tax disguised as levies, fees, duties, all the rest of it every single year. These fees are being tacked onto the purchases of everyday items, completely more or less unbeknownst to the Australian consumer. In other words, if you were to just buy the items without the government's insistence on charging you a levy or a fee at every single turn, you would be saving $34,000 every single year. It's really quite staggering when you think about it. And it would also help to explain why things are just so expensive these days. It's because as government grows, so too does its dependency on your income. Bigger governments require a bigger share. But it's not just on your income, it's on practically every single thing you buy and every single service that you use. This is the thing that irritates me about modern day governments and their approach to taxation. It's like they've got you no matter which way you go. It's like, just have one or the other. You don't need both. Either take my money at the point of earnings and leave me to go about my business in the free market, or let me keep all of my wage and tax me at the point of exchange. Why do you insist on doing both? I mean, this is why governments are so detested. They're just so blatantly greedy, to the point where if you think about it too long, it actually becomes really infuriating. As staggering as this finding is, what's perhaps even more astounding is that this practice of taxing an individual's blood, sweat, and tears in the form of an individual income tax is, in the great scheme of things, a relatively recent concept. Up until 1913, the idea of taxing an individual's labour in the form of an income tax was completely unheard of. Even to those in the United States Parliament, a country that now collects over $5.2 trillion a year in taxation from its citizens, the idea of personal income tax was considered so pervasive that one government official took it upon himself to outline his thoughts on the matter in the footnotes of a 1911 congressional record during the hearing of the federal income tax bill. The footnotes read as follows: "The American citizen has never in the history of the Republic been compelled to surrender a portion of their labour directly to the federal government." This was not a controversial view either, more of a statement of fact, because before the federal income bill was passed in 1913, in America in 1915 here in this country, governments made their money through tariffs, import duties, and excise tax. In other words, if you wanted to buy alcohol or tobacco or luxury items, or you wanted to purchase something from overseas, then a portion of the sale was liable to tax. There was simply no such thing as an individual income tax. That was the extent of the tax system. It incentivized a clean, humble, and nationalistic lifestyle, and only ever affected you through your indulgences. Prior to its conception, those in positions of power recognized that the relationship between the life force, or the labor, required to produce a product or a service, and the realized monetary value from such productions was not to be interfered with. The money made by the farmer selling his crops to the market belonged to the farmer. The money made by the textile worker transforming leather and thread into clothing belonged to the textile worker, and so on. Our ancestors never had to contend with the idea of having to forego a portion of their earnings to the federal government simply because they earned. Can you imagine the outrage that workers at that time must have felt, now having to come to terms with a new tax obligation? You would think there would be mass protests and rioting in the streets, but there wasn't. In fact, the populace took it pretty well, motivated by a moral call to action on the precipice of the entire world preparing for war. Thanks to some cunning government propaganda, the tax was viewed as a civil duty and was sold to the people as a temporary means of raising funds for the burgeoning war. Initially charged at only 1% on incomes over $3,000, with a top tax rate of 6% on incomes over $20,000, the intervention was extremely modest. But as with every government scheme, once legislated into being, it invariably becomes a complete abomination. Interesting to note here, though, that the average income during the 1910s was less than $2,000 a year. So there wasn't much pushback, really, because in its seminal form, it didn't really affect the majority of people. The true meaning of the Revenue Act of 1913, however, a meaning that had been hidden from the people of the time, was not to serve as an honourable means of raising funds for the brave souls preparing themselves for battle, but rather a coercive method of funding a self-centred, corrupt bureaucracy primarily interested in satisfying its own economic ends. A deception that, over 100 years later, is relentlessly inflicting its full effects. If you're anything like me, upon discovering this history, you're probably thinking that amendments to the Revenue Act of 1913 as a way to fund perpetual wars and line the pockets of public servants might have been enough, a step too far even. What we unfortunately find, however, is that the government was not done yet. Coinciding with the new, soon-to-be permanent tax laws was yet another cruel and utterly devious conception. Personally speaking, I would label this scheme as the cruelest and most devious conception that has ever existed. I am, of course, talking about the central banking system. Passed into law in the exact same year as the Revenue Act, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, for the first time in human history, gave a non-government institution the authority and ability to provide the federal government with instant and unlimited funds. They, of course, could do this in the form of a central bank. To this day, this utterly mind-boggling system enables the government to issue a bond, which is ultimately just a fancy-looking piece of paper, to the central bank in exchange for however much money it has decided that it needs. Are you a government looking to fund a pointless war in a Middle Eastern country in order to install democracy and extract its resources? Too easy. Just take your fancy piece of paper, bond, to the Federal Reserve, or the RBA as it's known in this country, and we'll issue you a line of credit to the amount that you desire. Are you a government that needs to provide a stimulus payment to its people during a pandemic? Should we say $337 billion? No problem. Just get that bond down to your trusted central bank and they'll take care of the rest. Are you a country whose banks have gone and gotten themselves into a bit of mischief due to some subprime lending and need, I don't know, say $700 billion to bail them out? Haven't you been listening? Of course we can fix it. Just get your bonds down to that central bank and we'll make all of your problems disappear. But just wait just 1 second. How do we actually pay back the loans? That's easy. It's called inflation. Turn on the TV or the radio at any given time and all anybody seems to be talking about is inflation. Every other news brief contains an article headline like Australia's inflation pressure rising amongst energy price shock, and despite a rate rise, Australia's CPI will likely remain high, highest in the modern world. But what even is inflation? Where does it come from, and why is everybody in the media always talking about it? According to the Reserve Bank of Australia, inflation is an increase in the level of prices of the goods and services that households typically buy. Inflation is measured by the Consumer Price Index, the CPI, which captures the changes in prices for the goods and services purchased by a typical household. What the Reserve Bank's definition fails to explain here, however, is why the prices of goods and services actually rise. We're told that the purpose of the RBA is to monitor inflation and interest rates in order to stabilize the economy during times of uncertainty. Most of us just kind of accept this and we don't really understand the true function of the Reserve Bank. I mean, the whole system is such a colossus and for the most of us, it's just too much to comprehend. And when you hear our Treasurer Jim Chalmers talk about cutting the excise tax on fuel by a measly 23 cents to help provide even just a little bit of cost of relief savings for Australians, there's always this rhetoric around how short-term cost-cutting measures are going to be even more damaging to our hip pockets further on down the road. When I hear about how the economy is going to have to make up for those losses somewhere along the way, it just makes my head spin. What do you mean losses? You're still making billions of dollars simply from taxing Australians every time they visit the Bowser. How are you losing? When did we ever agree that you could take billions of dollars in the form of excise tax every time I visit the petrol station? I don't recall agreeing to that. And besides, don't you already take 30% of my income each and every time I get paid? And yet here you are telling me that if I want to save 23 cents a litre on fuel so that I can go to work in order to give you my 30%, that I'm going to have to pay it back further down the track? How does this even work? What do you mean I'm going to have to pay for it later on? Okay, so here's the bottom line. If we want to properly understand inflation, we have to first understand the true underlying cause of inflation. I'll give it to you in one word: greed. And I'm not talking about the local baker or the butcher or the florist raising prices for a quick and easy buck, because it's not these people who are causing inflation, even though they are contributing to it. They are simply responding to inflation. Because if you think about it, these sorts of businesses don't really want to raise their prices, because all that's going to do is create uncertainty within the market by forcing customers to go elsewhere in search of cheaper prices. However, due to wasteful government spending, brought on by greed, this sort of practice becomes unavoidable for practically every business. The increasing costs of everyday consumer goods is merely a byproduct of an overarching system that is setting the terms for and directly benefiting from practically every transaction we make. A system that is responsible for an inflated money supply and the debasement of a nation's currency. And who is responsible for inflating the supply of money and debasing the currency here in this country? Well, that would be the Reserve Bank of Australia, at the behest of the federal government, of course. In very simple terms, and in terms that you won't hear described in any economic textbooks or on the website of the RBA, inflation is actually a tax. It is the tax that we pay for the privilege of being able to participate in a central banking system. It is the tax we pay on state-run initiatives like pandemic relief packages and private bank bailouts that are ultimately designed to benefit the ruling elite at the expense of everyday Australians. Every time the government authorises the RBA to create and release new money, the money that is already in supply becomes worth a little bit less. In other words, when the government decides that it is going to create $337 billion out of thin air and use that money to lock people in their homes, stop them from catching the flu, that money is eventually going to have to be paid back. That is inflation. It is nothing more than the repayment on the loan facilitated by the central bank to fund wasteful government spending. Yeah, that's all it is. They tax us on money that they are wasting, money that was created out of thin air. They authorise the checks, decide where the money is to be spent, line the pockets of their vested interest groups, and leave us to pick up the bill. But do you think that they'll ever tell us that that's what inflation actually is? Absolutely not. Why? Because it makes them look bad. What happens if you decide that from now on you're not going to pay your taxes? Well, you'll lose all of your assets for a start. They'll seize your house, your cars, and your jewelry, and if they really want to make an example out of you, they'll put you in jail. Or alternatively, what happens if you decide that you're going to follow the government's lead and just make some money out of nothing? Make some money of your own. Just start printing it like they do. Well, that's called counterfeiting, and it is highly illegal. I mean, isn't that just incredible? When we do it, as in print our own money, it's called counterfeiting. We go to jail. But when they do it, it's called quantitative easing or government stimulus. And they all pat themselves on the back for it, while the rest of us suffer. So when you hear people ask, yeah, but where are we going to get the money? Or when you hear governments cry poor and tell you that short-term cuts are going to cost you dearly further down the line, just remember, there was a time where income tax didn't exist. There was a time without inflation. There was a time where banks acted as nothing more than financial intermediaries. There was a time where governments acted in the interests of the people they were elected to represent. There was a time where those in positions of power knew that there was only so far that they could push their people before their people started pushing back. It's time we sent them a reminder. The purpose of government is to protect and promote a lifestyle that its citizens can properly afford. We have the money. $1 trillion every year. We can even print the money if we really want to. As much as we need, out of nothing but thin air. What we don't have is a system of government that understands the needs of its people and how that money should best be spent. Central banking, personal income tax, these systems aren't going anywhere. We can't make them go away. What we can do, however, is harness these systems for the good of the people and to use them in ways that benefits us, not them. So the next time somebody asks, where are we going to get the money, just remind them that we've got the money. The money's not the problem. What we don't have, however, and what we so desperately need, are people in government with the backbone and courage to stand up to these cartels, to tell them that the people are no longer going to tolerate the deception and corruption. Our current politicians will tax and print all the money in the world, but until we get good people in government who genuinely care about improving the lots of everyday Australians, then the future that looked so bright and promising to us will be for future generations nothing more than a faint and distant dream.